Give it back, Arthur. It's tacky, and frankly, it makes your mother look like she's still haunting the kitchen. My daughter-in-law, Brenda, didn't even look up from her phone. She was 34, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, and standing in the middle of the baby shower. The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped. The hum of conversation in my living room died, replaced by the sharp, metallic sound of the wedding ring hitting the side of the trash can. I stood there, my hand still outstretched, the air in the room suddenly thin and metallic. My pulse hammered against my collarbone, a steady, angry rhythm. I was 68, a man who had built a construction supply company from a single rusted truck. Yet, I felt a tremor in my fingers that I couldn't command. Brenda, my voice came out lower, rougher than I intended. She finally glanced up, her eyes wide with a practiced, wide-eyed innocence that never quite reached her expressionless face. The smell of expensive floral perfume and half-eaten shrimp cocktail hung heavy in the air. "Oh, lighten up, Arthur," she said, waving a manicured hand toward the bin. "It's just a piece of old metal. We're modern, remember? I'm redecorating the legacy. You should thank me." I didn't thank her. I turned my head slowly, searching for my son, Michael. He was standing by the punch bowl, his gaze fixed intently on the floor. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just stayed there, adjusting his cufflinks, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My wife had been gone for 8 years. 8 years of quiet mornings and cold coffee, and that ring had been the one tether I had left to the woman who helped me build this life. I walked past Brenda, the carpet muffling my steps. I reached into the trash bin, my fingers brushing against the cold, discarded foil wrappers and citrus peels, until I felt the solid, familiar weight of the gold band. I pulled it out, wiped it on my handkerchief, and tucked it into my pocket. "Arthur, don't be dramatic," Brenda called out behind me. "Everyone's watching." I didn't stop. I walked out of my own house, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the quiet street. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a call from a client, but saw Michael's name on the screen. I answered, my grip tightening on the ring in my pocket. "Dad," Michael said, his voice clipped, hurried. "Brenda is hysterical. She says you made a scene. Look, you need to be careful. That ring, it's specifically listed in your will as a personal bequest. You can't just walk off with items like that. It complicates things." I stopped dead on the sidewalk, the cold Ohio wind biting at my face. "Is that all you have to say?" I asked. "Dad, I'm just telling you," he repeated, his tone devoid of any warmth. "That ring is in your will. You need to think about the legal implications of what you're doing." I stared at my phone screen. The name Michael burned against the glass. There was a pause on the line. For a second I thought he was finally going to apologize for what Brenda had done. I repeated, my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my veins. "Brenda is crying, Dad. She feels humiliated," Michael said. He didn't mention the trash can. He didn't mention the woman he'd married throwing his own mother's legacy into the garbage. "Just bring the ring back. We can sort out the legal side later." I hung up. The silence of the street was sudden, absolute, and strangely comforting. I walked to my sedan, the metal cool against my palm, and sat for a moment while the engine hummed to life. My hands were finally still. Inside the house, the shower was still going on. I could hear the muffled sound of women laughing, oblivious to the fact that their host had just walked out on them. I pulled the ring from my pocket. The gold was warm now. It held the shape of my late wife's finger, the phantom weight of 30 years of building a company and a home, of navigating the lean years when we ate nothing but soup and shared one winter coat. That ring wasn't jewelry. It was the only tangible proof that we had once meant something. I drove away, putting distance between myself and the house. My phone buzzed again, then a third time. When I finally glanced at the screen, the recent call log showed Michael's name repeated over and over, alongside 2 unanswered calls from Brenda. The timestamps painted a clearer picture than any apology could. Neither message mentioned Eleanor's ring. Every voicemail was about the scene, the embarrassment, and the fallout. I saved the call history without deleting anything. If I ever questioned my memory, the phone records would remind me exactly how that afternoon unfolded. I didn't look. The estate attorney, a man who had seen every version of family rot imaginable, was expecting my call tomorrow. For the first time in 8 years, the static in my head cleared. I stopped at a small diner near the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled of stale coffee and burnt toast. I ordered black coffee and sat in the back booth. The waitress, a woman who looked like she had seen too much and expected too little, poured the steaming cup without a word. I watched the steam rise, curling in the pale light. My mind raced back to the day my wife had given me that ring, 3 decades ago, in a church with peeling paint and a leaking roof. She had pressed it into my hand, her eyes bright with a conviction I hadn't yet earned. She had told me that respect wasn't given, it was built, and that once the foundation cracked, you couldn't just patch it with apologies. I looked at the ring sitting on the table. It sparkled, a small, stubborn defiance in the dim light of the booth. Michael's voice echoed in my memory, not the son I had raised, but the man he had become. A man who measured his life in property clauses and legal buffers. I should have seen it sooner. For 8 years, every insult followed the same pattern. Brenda would cross another line. I would look at Michael, waiting for him to speak. Every time, he adjusted his tie, looked at the floor, or changed the subject. Eventually, I stopped waiting for words. His silence had become his answer. I pulled a small notepad from my jacket and began writing. My hand moved with a clarity that surprised me. By the time the waitress returned with the check, I had finished a list. It was a short list, but it was enough to change everything. I knew then that I couldn't keep pretending nothing had changed. Tomorrow, I would meet with my estate attorney, not to demand a new will, but to understand my options. Eleanor had asked me never to rewrite our estate plan in a moment of anger. If anything changed, it had to come from clarity, not humiliation. Before making any decision, I wanted to hear what the law required, what the consequences would be, and whether 8 years of quiet compromise had finally become something I could no longer justify. The waitress dropped the bill. I didn't reach for my wallet immediately. I looked out the window at the parking lot, wondering if Michael was currently deciding whether to drive here and finish the conversation, or if he was still waiting for me to apologize to his wife. I closed my notebook. Whatever happened next, I was finally ready to face the truth instead of avoiding it. Whether that truth led to forgiveness or a new beginning, I would decide only after hearing everything Marcus had to say. The phone remained silent for 2 hours after I left the diner. I sat in my study, the room filled with the scent of old paper and leather-bound books. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward the desk, where my wife's journals sat stacked in a neat, daunting tower. I had not opened them in years. Opening them felt like an admission that she was truly gone, that the house was no longer ours, but mine alone. My palm rested against the cover of the oldest volume. The leather was worn thin, softened by the thousands of times she had held it. I finally flipped it open. Her handwriting, elegant and slanted, filled the pages with memories of our early life, the days of building the business, the nights we spent dreaming of the future, and the unwavering belief she had held that our son would one day embody the same principles we lived by. "Dad?" Michael stood in the doorway. He looked disheveled, his tie loosened and his eyes darting toward the desk, as if measuring how much of the journals he could see from the threshold. He didn't step inside. He stayed in the hallway, anchored to the familiar territory of a man who didn't want to be caught trespassing. "I called," he said, shifting his weight. She's still upset. She doesn't understand why you're making this into such a spectacle." I closed the journal, but not before seeing a passage where she had written about him, about how much she loved him, and how much she feared that he would confuse wealth with character. I looked at the man he had become. His concern was entirely focused on optics, on the disruption to his social routine, on the immediate discomfort caused by an old man refusing to play the part he'd been assigned. "Brenda isn't the victim here, Michael," I said. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the hammering of my heart, and I am not the one who turned this into a spectacle. "It was a ring, Dad. Just a ring," he snapped, stepping into the room. "Why are you acting like this now? Why after all these years?" His frustration was genuine, which was the most painful part of the entire exchange. He genuinely did not see it. He had spent his life watching me accommodate his wife's whims, watching me smile through the slights, and now that the pattern had broken, he felt as though the laws of physics had shifted. My cell phone buzzed on the mahogany surface. I glanced down. It was a voicemail notification from my estate attorney asking if I was still willing to meet the following morning. I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone. For the first time, I decided not to avoid the conversation. I picked up the device, turning it off completely, and slid it into the drawer. "I suppose you'll find out soon enough," I replied, my eyes locking onto his. "You should go home, Michael. Your wife is waiting." He stood there for a long moment, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and irritation, before turning back toward the stairs. I heard the front door click shut behind him. I walked to the window, watching his car pull away into the darkness of the Columbus suburbs. The house was empty now, yet for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a decision. The next morning, the office of my attorney, Marcus, smelled of floor wax and expensive mahogany. He sat behind a desk that had seen more family betrayals than most priests here in a lifetime. Marcus looked at me, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and tapped a thick file resting between us. "Arthur, you understand the gravity of this," Marcus said. He didn't use soft words. He spoke in facts, which was exactly why I hired him. We are not just amending a document. We are revoking a legally executed will and replacing it entirely. Given your son's potential reaction, we must ensure your testamentary capacity is beyond reproach. I nodded, my fingers tracing the rim of the glass of water he'd provided. I want it airtight, Marcus. I want no room for them to claim I was manipulated or coerced. Marcus pulled a fountain pen from his pocket and laid it across the legal pad. Then we follow the protocol. Independent physician evaluation first. Then, we document your intent. You need to prove this change is a rational decision, not an emotional reaction to a single incident. My mind drifted back 8 years, to the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading dreams. My wife, Eleanor, had been breathing shallowly, her hand gripping mine with a strength that belied her frail appearance. She had known then, what I refused to see, that our son's kindness was conditional, and that Brenda would eventually test the boundaries of my patience. "Promise me, Arthur," she had whispered, her eyes fixed on mine. "Don't change our will in a moment of anger. Only change it when you are certain that your doubt has turned into clarity. When you know who they truly are, act then." For years, I had held onto that original will like a shield, protecting the illusion that she was wrong. I had ignored the snide comments, the subtle push to retire early, the way Brenda treated my home like a waiting room for my eventual death. I had kept that will unchanged, hoping every day that the man I raised would finally step forward and defend his mother's memory. "Arthur?" Marcus asked, his voice pulling me back. "Are you with me?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I have the clarity now. I've had it for years, I think. I just didn't want to admit it." Marcus made a note on his pad. "The ring itself isn't the issue, Arthur. The issue is that your current estate plan reflects decisions you made 8 years ago. If you're replacing this will, every distribution should be reviewed together, not because of the ring, but because your intentions have changed. Are you prepared for the fallout?" "The ring represents the values she left behind," I said, looking at the attorney. "If they cannot respect the symbol, they have no right to the inheritance it protects." I should have seen the end coming that day in the hospital. I hadn't, but I saw it now, and it was time to put the past to rest. Marcus set the pen down with a sharp click that echoed in the silent office. He looked at me, his gaze professional and measured. The office smelled of old paper and polished wood. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence carried more weight than any legal document on the desk. "I need you to understand something, Arthur," Marcus said, leaning forward. "Executing a new will while you're alive isn't about probate. It's about exercising your legal right to control your estate plan. To prevent your son from claiming undue influence later, we require a clean bill of mental health. I have a contact, Dr. Eris, who can conduct a formal evaluation of your testamentary capacity today." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief settle into my bones. The chaos of the past few days, the insults thrown by Brenda, and the hollow silence from Michael were finally narrowing into a singular, logical path. "Do what is necessary," I told him. Marcus pulled a folder from a drawer, sliding it across the desk. It contained the draft of my new will, a document that stripped away the vague promises I had clung to for 8 years. Every line was clear. Every provision was designed to ensure that the moral legacy Eleanor left behind would be protected from people who only understood the price of things, never their value. "We will need 2 witnesses who are not beneficiaries of your estate," Marcus added. "I can arrange for my junior associates to be present when you sign tomorrow." I stood up, my legs feeling steady for the first time in weeks. I looked out the window at the busy street below, watching people rush toward their own futures, unaware that mine was being methodically dismantled and rebuilt. "Schedule the doctor for this afternoon," I said, "and set the signing for first thing in the morning. I want this done before Michael realizes what is happening." Driving home, the engine's hum felt like a countdown. I arrived at the house, a structure that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for the life Eleanor and I had built. My phone sat in the center console, dark and silent. I had turned it off, refusing to invite Michael's excuses back into my world. Before heading inside, I reached into my coat and felt the cold, hard gold of the ring tucked safely away. It served as a reminder that I was no longer protecting a memory. I was finally defending it. I had spent 8 years refusing to touch that will. Not because I doubted Eleanor, but because I kept hoping Michael would become the man we raised. Brenda throwing Eleanor's ring into the trash didn't create my decision. It simply removed my last excuse for delaying it. Now, I wondered what else I might have been wrong about. I walked into my study, the room still holding the quiet intensity of the afternoon evaluation. Dr. Aris had been thorough, asking questions that forced me to recount the timeline of my own life, testing the edges of my memory until I was certain of every detail. He had left with a signed certificate of competency, leaving me alone with the final piece of the puzzle, Eleanor's last letter. I pulled the envelope from the hidden compartment in my desk, the paper yellowing at the edges. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The letter carried the faint scent of jasmine, the same flowers she used to grow beside the back porch. One breath was enough to pull me back to the years we spent building our life together in this house. "Dearest Arthur," she had written, "if you are reading this, then the time has come to be the man I know you are. We built this life on a foundation of respect, not just for each other, but for the legacy we promised to leave behind. That ring is the heart of it. It was never about the price tag, nor the gold. It was about the promise we made when we had nothing else to give." I looked at the gold band resting on my desk. For years, I had treated it like a relic, something to be preserved behind glass. I finally understood that she had meant for it to be a torch, passed only to those who demonstrated the character to carry it. The realization was sharp, a sudden clarity that made my previous hesitation feel like a betrayal. My life had become a series of quiet concessions to Brenda's vanity and Michael's apathy. I had let them erode the very values Eleanor died trying to instill in our family. The letter continued, detailing her hopes for our grandchildren, not that they would be rich, but that they would be kind, honest, and courageous enough to stand up for what mattered. I folded the letter and placed it alongside the draft of the new will. Marcus had created a legal fortress, but this letter was the soul of my intent. It wasn't enough to just change the documents. I needed to make it clear why. If I died tomorrow, I wanted them to know that this decision wasn't born of spite, but of a deep, aching necessity to preserve the only thing that actually mattered. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floorboards. I reached for the phone, my movements deliberate. I dialed Marcus's number and waited for him to pick up. When he answered, I didn't mince words. "Proceed," I said. "Every word as we discussed. I want it finished by morning." I hung up, feeling the weight of the last 8 years finally beginning to lift. I knew Michael would probably be furious, and Brenda would almost certainly see this as an unforgivable betrayal, but I had finally accepted that their reaction was no longer mine to control. The sun rose over Columbus, casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the hardwood floors of my study. Marcus arrived precisely at 8, accompanied by 2 junior associates who carried themselves with the practiced neutrality of people accustomed to witnessing high-stakes family departures. They set up a temporary workstation on my desk, arranging the documents with precise, angular movements. "You understand what this means, Arthur?" Marcus asked, placing the fountain pen near my hand. "Once you sign, the previous will is void. Once this will is executed, it becomes your governing estate plan unless you later choose to revoke or amend it again while you still have legal capacity." I glanced at the pages. They were filled with dense, technical language, yet the core of the document was simple and elegant. My grandchildren were protected, their futures secured beyond the reach of anyone who viewed inheritance as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. Whatever happened between Michael and me, the next generation would never pay the price for our failures. The ring, that small, heavy piece of gold, was now a symbolic bequest, managed under conditions that Brenda would never satisfy. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I took the pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a sound that felt like a line being drawn through the last 8 years of my life. I signed my name, each letter steady and firm, then watched as the 2 associates added their own signatures, confirming that the person sitting before them was of sound mind and clear intent. Marcus witnessed the final page, his expression as unreadable as ever. "It is finished," he announced. The associates packed their briefcases, their movements quiet and efficient, and within minutes, the office was empty again. Marcus remained behind for a moment, gathering the new documents into a thick, protective binder. "I will secure the executed originals in accordance with the arrangements we discussed, and you should keep your certified copies in your safe," he said, tucking the binder under his arm. You have taken the necessary steps to safeguard your legacy. I would suggest keeping the copies in your safe, just in case. He left, and the house felt suddenly, profoundly still. I walked to the window, watching his car pull away from the curb. I hadn't told Michael. He still thought he was standing on solid ground, waiting for me to apologize for the scene at the baby shower. He had no idea that the foundation beneath him had been completely rewritten that morning. I reached into my pocket, feeling the cool metal of the ring. For the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise kept. I turned away from the window, wondering how long it would take for the silence in the house to be broken by a call I was finally ready to answer. Michael arrived exactly at 4, his car crunching loudly over the gravel driveway. Brenda stepped out right behind him, her arms crossed tight against her chest, eyes scanning my house like she was already calculating the resale value. They didn't knock. They just let themselves in, bringing a cold draft into the entryway that smelled of expensive cologne and artificial stress. "We need to talk, Arthur," Michael said, bypassing any greeting. He marched toward the living room, his movements stiff and hurried. I followed them slowly, watching the way Brenda navigated my home. She touched the mantel, wiping a finger over the surface to check for dust, a familiar gesture of disdain she had perfected over the last 6 years. She stood in the center of the room, looking at me with a weary, practiced impatience. "Are you going to keep playing the martyr?" Brenda asked, her voice sharp as glass. "It was just a shower, and it was just a ring. You've been acting like a child for days, and Michael is sick of it." "I am not acting like a child, Brenda," I said, keeping my tone level. I stood by the door, refusing to move deeper into the space they had occupied. "I am simply tired of pretending that disrespect is the same thing as a mistake." "It was a mistake," Michael shouted, his face reddening. "She didn't know what it was. How was she supposed to know that a dusty old piece of gold was the center of your entire world?" "Because I told you both," I replied. "I told you exactly what that ring represented. You chose not to listen." Brenda let out a short, hollow laugh, turning to pace the rug. "Oh, please. Eleanor's been gone for 8 years. A ring won't bring her back. Maybe it's time you stopped living in the past and started acting like everyone else has." "I am moving on," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through her noise. "I've spent today ensuring that the legacy she and I built remains intact, protected from people who only see value in what they can sell." Michael paused, his brow furrowing. A flicker of something fear perhaps crossed his features. "What are you talking about? What did you do today?" "I did what I should have done 8 years ago," I said. Brenda scoffed, her gaze sliding toward the display case. "You're talking like you've changed the will again. Who cares? It's just paper. We're family." "You'd never actually cut us out." She was so certain. It was that entitlement that had finally opened my eyes. I watched them standing there, 2 people so convinced of their own importance that they couldn't conceive of a world where their behavior had real, permanent consequences. "Michael," I said, looking at my son, "you always told me to keep the peace. You told me to ignore her slights because that was how you survived. But you didn't survive, son. You just vanished." He took a step toward me, his hands shaking slightly. "Dad, tell me you didn't do anything stupid." "I did the only sensible thing left," I said. "I made sure that Eleanor's values finally have a chance to survive without your interference." Michael stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to find a language I would finally understand. Brenda stood perfectly still, her face drained of color, the mask of confident disdain finally slipping to reveal the cold reality underneath. "You changed the will," Michael said. It wasn't a question. He leaned against the entryway wall, the air in the room thick with the scent of stagnant resentment. "You actually went to Marcus and rewrote everything because of one argument?" "The argument was merely the final piece of evidence," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, calm, detached, yet heavy with the weight of 8 years of held breaths. "I didn't change the will because of one afternoon. I changed it because I finally stopped waiting for you to be the man I raised." Brenda let out a sharp, jagged sound, a mix between a laugh and a sob. She looked at Michael, waiting for him to fix it, to use the influence he'd always claimed to have over me. When he didn't move, she turned her eyes back to me, her gaze hardening into something predatory. Brenda's eyes instantly filled with tears. She looked toward Michael as though she were the wounded one. "Arthur," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "after everything I've done for this family, you're trying to destroy us. The performance might have fooled strangers. It no longer fooled me. You're an old man who let grief cloud your judgment. We'll challenge the new will." We'll argue you lacked testamentary capacity and that someone manipulated you into changing it. We'll fight every inch of it in court. Marcus has already handled that, Brenda, I said. I obtained an independent medical evaluation confirming I had testamentary capacity, followed every execution requirement my attorney recommended, and signed the replacement will before disinterested witnesses. You're free to challenge it if you choose. Whether any challenge succeeds is for a court to decide, but we took every reasonable legal step to ensure my wishes would be respected. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael looked away, his gaze falling to the floor where my late wife's photo hung on the wall. He couldn't meet my eyes. He couldn't meet her gaze, either. "Dad, please," Michael whispered, his voice cracking. "We can talk about this. We can bring in a mediator. We can fix whatever mess you've made." "There is nothing to fix," I said. "Legal documents can protect an estate, Michael. They cannot rebuild trust." Marcus reminded me of that this morning. "A replacement will can determine where property goes after I'm gone, but it cannot undo years of silence. That part was always your choice." Brenda grabbed Michael's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Don't talk to him," she hissed, her eyes darting toward the front door. "He's done. We're leaving." "Yes," I agreed. "You are." I watched them turn and walk out. Michael walked like a man who had suddenly forgotten where he was going. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time, but I didn't offer any comfort. As they reached the driveway, my phone vibrated with a message from one of the guests who had attended the baby shower. She wrote that she had been thinking about what happened all afternoon and wanted me to know that everyone in the room had seen Brenda throw Eleanor's ring into the trash. "You didn't imagine it," she wrote. Several of us were shocked, but no one knew what to say. I read the message once, locked the screen, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I no longer needed validation, but knowing someone else had witnessed the truth brought an unexpected sense of peace. I wondered if he understood yet that the loss wasn't just financial. It was the end of the leverage he thought he held over my life. The silence following their departure hung in the air like dust after a storm. I spent the remainder of the evening in the study, surrounded by the ghosts of a life I had finally stopped trying to salvage. My mind kept returning to the cemetery, to the simple stone marking Eleanor's final resting place. I needed to go there. Not to ask for permission, I had already crossed that bridge, but to tell her that the weight she carried for so long was finally being laid down. I arrived at the cemetery just as the sun began to bleed into the horizon. The grass was cool beneath my boots, damp with the coming night. I stood before the headstone, the granite cold against my fingertips. "I did it, Eleanor," I said, my voice quiet against the vastness of the trees. "The ring is safe. The legacy is protected." A car pulled into the gravel path behind me. Michael climbed out. His eyes were swollen, as though sleep had abandoned him the moment he realized I had actually followed through. For the first time in years, he looked less like a successful executive and more like the frightened little boy who once hid behind his mother's legs whenever he knew he'd done something wrong. He walked slowly, his shoulders slumped in a way I had not seen since he was a child. He stopped a few feet away, refusing to stand next to me. "Brenda isn't coming," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at the headstone. He looked at his shoes. "She's already talking to a lawyer. She thinks there must be some way to force your hand." "There isn't," I said. I didn't look at him, either. I kept my gaze fixed on the letters carved into the stone. "You know that, Michael. You're just here because you're afraid of what comes next." "I'm here because you're my father," he snapped, though the defiance lacked any real heat. "I'm here because I don't know who you are anymore. The man who raised me wouldn't have been this cruel." I turned then, meeting his eyes. They were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a desperate, childish confusion. "Cruelty would have been letting you continue this charade," I said. "I didn't take your inheritance to hurt you. I took it because you had stopped being a steward of our family's values. I'm offering you forgiveness, Michael. I'm offering you a chance to be my son again, but I am not offering you the keys to a kingdom you never worked to build." He started to speak, then stopped. His jaw worked, the muscle ticking in a rhythm of suppressed rage and genuine agonizing realization. He wanted to argue, to demand, to plead, but he looked at the stone, and then at me, and seemed to understand that the leverage had completely evaporated. "Is that it then?" he asked. "Everything we had? All of it? Gone? Because I didn't stop her?" "You had 8 years to stop her," I replied. "You chose the path of least resistance. That is the tragedy here, not the money." He stood there for a long time, the wind picking up around us, tearing at the edges of his coat. I turned back to Eleanor. I had said what I needed to say. Whether he could survive the truth of his own choices was no longer my burden to carry. The drive home from the cemetery was quiet, the cabin filled only with the rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt. I felt a strange lightness, as if the past 8 years had been a suit of armor I was finally shedding. Michael had not called, and Brenda remained silent, their absence a testament to the fact that our relationship had been tethered to an expectation of control that no longer existed. I arrived at the house and walked through the foyer. It was empty, yet the air felt different. I went into the study and sat at the desk, opening the final volume of Eleanor's journals. I wrote one last entry, describing the confrontation at the cemetery and the quiet resolve that had settled into my bones. I wasn't punishing my son. I was liberating my family's legacy from the decay of entitlement. The next morning, Marcus stopped by one last time to deliver the filed originals and certified copies. He placed the binder carefully on my desk, opened it one final time to confirm every signature, then closed the file with deliberate precision, resting one hand on the binder for a brief moment before sliding it into his briefcase. It felt less like paperwork and more like the closing chapter of an entire lifetime. Legally, he said, resting one hand on the binder, everything is complete. No document can guarantee family harmony, Arthur. It can only guarantee that your wishes are respected. He slid the closed file into his briefcase, shook my hand, and quietly walked out. Watching the front door close behind him, I realized that the legal chapter of my life had ended. What remained was simply learning how to live with the truth. I sat alone in the study, the sun warming the top of the mahogany desk. I took the ring from my pocket and placed it back inside its velvet case, closing the lid with a satisfying, soft click. It would stay there until the next generation showed they were ready to carry the weight of it, not just the prestige. I walked to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the morning light. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was a blank slate. Outside, the grass was green, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the world was moving on. Brenda would keep fighting, of course. She would pour her energy into legal motions and bitter phone calls, but she was fighting a war against a ghost. She had assumed that because she had proximity, she had possession. She had assumed that because I had been silent, I was absent. She had been wrong on every count. I stepped onto the back porch, looking out over the yard where my grandchildren would eventually play. They would grow up knowing the truth of what this family stood for, not through money, but through the actions we took when everything was at stake. I took a slow sip of coffee, watching a bird land on the fence, its wings tucked neatly against its side. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. I was finally at peace, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. If this story taught me anything, it's that love and accountability can exist at the same time. I never stopped loving my son. I simply stopped rewarding choices that dishonored everything his mother and I built together. Wealth fades, houses are sold, businesses change hands, but the standards you refuse to compromise become the only inheritance that truly lasts. If someone close to you keeps asking you to sacrifice your dignity in the name of family, ask yourself one question. Are you protecting the relationship or merely protecting their comfort? I'd rather leave behind fewer dollars and stronger values than the other way around. Money can be inherited. Property can be inherited. Even family names can be inherited. Respect never can. Every generation has to earn it for themselves. The lesson here is not that you should cut people off at the first sign of friction, but that you must recognize the difference between a mistake and a pattern. When someone repeatedly demonstrates that they do not value what you hold sacred, you are not being cruel by drawing a line. You are being a guardian of your own peace. You have to decide what your legacy is made of. Is it made of the things you sacrifice to keep the peace, or is it made of the values you refuse to compromise? Even when it cost you everything? If you are still holding on to a version of someone that no longer exists, or perhaps a version of them that never existed at all, you are only delaying your own clarity. You deserve a life where you are not constantly apologizing for the space you take up or the boundaries you set. You have the right to curate your own legacy, ensuring it lands in hands that have proven they can hold it with the reverence it deserves. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a relationship and protecting your self-respect? What happened after you finally drew the line? Share your story in the comments. Someone reading it today might need that courage. Is there someone in your world who treats your kindness like a weakness, or who views your history as something to be discarded? Think about the things you are holding on to right now, not because they bring you joy, but because you are afraid of the silence that would follow if you let them go. Are you keeping the peace at the expense of your own integrity? I want you to ask yourself, what is the cost of the silence you are currently maintaining? If you spoke your truth today, if you laid down the burden you have been carrying for someone else's comfort, who would you truly be? Share with me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between keeping a relationship and keeping your self-respect? And what did you learn when you finally chose yourself?